Hello and welcome to this session. It's Connecting Mobility in a Post-COVID World. I am delighted to introduce you to three luminaries of our industry. I have with me today Lynn Shotwell, who is the CEO and President of Worldwide ERC. Steve Cryne is the CEO and President of the CERC, the Canadian Employee Relocation Council. And as you all know, Zurlinden is the CEO of EuRA. Thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Steve, we were supposed to be with you last week in Vancouver. You ran a great virtual event. That went well, huh?
The jury's still out, yes. But from the feedback, the initial feedback that we received from the delegates, yeah, and we tracked it on a daily basis. Our keynote speaker was good, and we got high marks for the content in the sessions.
Fantastic, congratulations. And I mean, Lynn, this is a whole new world of event management, and obviously it's something that we as associations is kind of part of our lifeblood, really. And we were supposed to be with you in DC in October. How are you coming along with your virtual event? It's looking amazing.
Well, we're watching you closely, and we watched Steve last week. Ours launches on October 28th, and it's a month-long event, because what we did is we put together both our Washington conference, our Global Workforce Symposium, and then we had several regional summits planned. So we are trying to pull everything into one big umbrella over the course of a month.
Well, congratulations for jumping on that so quickly, because this is, as we all know, this is a very steep learning curve.
It is.
So it's great to have us together. Tad, you obviously we launched the Not in Seville get together back in May, and I think you were quite happy with how that went. Let me ask, first of all, Lynn, since this pandemic hit, I think your appointment or your moving into the role of CEO and President actually coincided with the start of lockdown, right?
It did. So I started on March 30th, and I still have not met most of my team in person. We continue to work virtually, but this is becoming normal. It's now, what, 6 months into this, and I think we're all getting used to the Zoom calls and connecting and meeting everyone in a different environment. And what I'm starting to see happen is some of that chat that at first everything was very formal, but some of that informality in the chat starting to happen, and so it's all good.
It's like you say, it's a completely different environment in which to be able to converse. And I mean, we've said this as a team that we miss some of that creativity. Steve, how has this been for you and your team?
Well, same as, well, I obviously have met my staff, but I haven't seen in person except over Zoom my staff. So and planning and for these events is a challenge, because there's no playbook for a lot of the things that we are trying to do. And we've been going back. I just think about the questions that we were asking of the EuRA app that we used. We were asking the developers of those, and they said, that's a good question, we could probably do that. and so we made up some things on the fly, so to speak, and so I think it's an opportunity for us to do some of those things. But some of the feedback last week was people they desperately miss being in person.
Absolutely.
And no matter what we do through these platforms, and yes, we can deliver absolutely outstanding content through this. What you can't replicate is that in person, having a pint at the bar, or a drink at the bar, or having a coffee with somebody in the hallway, or just those casual, like Lynn said, the casual conversations are creeping back into this. But it will not, in my mind at least, I don't think it'll replicate that in-person intimacy that we have, which is really important in our industry.
I agree with you 1,000%. It's not just, I mean, our industry is a person-to-person human relationship industry. And I mean, we all know that feeling. We go to those conferences and, half of the joy of that is, hey, I haven't seen you in a year. How are you? Tad, this is now what? We're now nearly 17, 18 months since EuRA got together at its last big event in Munich. What kind of, how's this impacting on our members?
Well, I mean, just as Steve said, people are desperate to get together. They're desperate to meet each other, and we're obviously really, really upset when we had to cancel Seville, which, by the way, was the last thing I did before coming home on the 13th of March, my last flight of the year. And, and ever since then, we've been working from home, basically since then, because that's the way we have to be. And I think this has been difficult for all of the members. I mean, a lot of them are, again, working from home. People talking about closing offices because, why pay for something you're not using? And I think it's been very, very hard. And okay, this is not necessarily the best way in which to run a conference or run an event, but it's the best we've got at the moment. And I've got to say that I'm very pleased that we're recording this session after what happened last Friday, where we had recorded the session for CERC and we were supposed to go online to answer questions in the Q&A. And what happened? Dominic and I had a power cut. Now, to those of you British people amongst you watching who believe in conspiracy theories, as far as I'm concerned, it was Boris Johnson turning the lights off so we didn't all go down the pub.
And Tad, actually, I'm going to, if I can, continue with you, because you're saying there about how you transition things, and how is EuRA managing, and what strategies have been put in place to try and kind of get through these challenges?
Well, I mean, from a financial perspective, you and I decided to take salary cuts just to keep things going, to make sure that the association survived. We have in fact got rid of the office. If you watch the EuRA Goes Home film, you'll see what happened. And that is going to save a significant amount of money starting the beginning of next year, which is a good thing. In terms of the members, obviously we want to retain our members if we can at all. Dominic had this amazing idea that we should offer our training for free back in about April, early April, and we started to do that, and that resulted in literally thousands of people, or thousands of the courses being taken. It gave members and their staff something to do when they had nothing to do. It was constructive. It helped them. It helps them build their businesses. We've also introduced briefings, which I think we'll continue doing ever after, which will come between conferences and will of course be virtual. And the other thing which has been amazing is Dom has interviewed members everywhere to find out what's going on, what's happening here, what's happening there, comparing what somebody says about what's going on in France to, for example, what our newspapers say is going on in France, and seeing the differences, different reports, different attitudes towards the whole thing, and seeing who's beginning to come out of this, and who those of us who are still slightly stuck in it. So, we have been pretty blooming active doing what we can, and basically trying to help our members, which I'm quite sure is the same with Steve and with Lynn.
Well, I was going to ask you. So, I mean, Lynn, again, so you've come into this new role in a virtual world, in an incredibly prestigious organization. What were the sort of strategies that you were working on in this, very, very intense time, I'm sure?
So, I was lucky to come in where the board had adopted a new strategic plan a year ago. And so my job when I interviewed was, how would I implement this strategic plan? And I'd say, the details have maybe changed, but the areas that I'm focusing on are not different than what I identified in January. So the first thing is, my people. What are their talents? What are their skills? How do I make sure I have a really strong team? And I walked into a strong team, but we've had to do some reorganization. Financial, and that takes me to the second issue, which was my money, right? So I knew coming in, I had to figure out were we spending our resources and putting resources into the things that were really going to drive us towards the future. So I spent a lot of time looking at, 40 years of products and services, and then, both revenue and expenses, and saying what makes sense as we go forward. And, COVID's only accelerated this, because I think we all rely a lot on conference revenue, and we had to cancel our May event, and now we've taken this one online. So big changes there. And then the next area I focused on is our members. And I think that's probably been the one that's the most important, but it's been, in some ways, luckily my team knows our members very well, and they're in tune with kind of what are the things we need to offer to members to really meet their needs. Both what did we need before COVID, and now what do we need to do at this point in time. So we've had to really shift. My plan had been to meet and network with people during our conferences, host special events, host roundtables, focus groups. All of that's had to go either virtual or just shifted. So we're still focusing on that. And then the last thing is my board of directors. So I came in knowing I had to, as a new CEO, build a relationship with the board of directors and really implement their vision and their strategic plan. So again, still working on that, but that's all been in a virtual environment. So,
I mean, those are a lot of balls to be juggling in the air in the best of circumstances. So,
yeah.
I take that. And I mean, Steve, obviously, you strategized immediately moving your event online as soon as you could. How what's been your strategy, and how's it been?
It's been challenging. Obviously, we had our strategic planning session. We had a 2-day planning session in late January, early February. We came off of that, and then lockdown. And it was like, where do we go from here? How do we support our members? And that became the first priority. Was how much information could we get out there as quickly as possible to help them navigate through some of the. There's so much uncertainty and ambiguity at that time. Was it going to last? Was it a week? Was it? And we were all quite optimistic that this was a short-term thing, and things will get back to normal very quickly. And then all of that changed. Towards the end of April, I think we really started to realize that we were not going to be able to host a conference, or if we were, it was going to be a limited scale. I have a staff of 3. There's 3 people here. My office manager, she left just before COVID started. She found another position, and so I just said, hey, we have to wait this out. So we've gone through it day by day. But the major part of everything that we've been focused on has been, the virtual conference, and no idea the complexities of doing this. I thought it would be very simple. I thought, we just get a company, and we just, we have lots of speakers. That's the one thing that we already had a conference, so to speak, in the can. We had a program that was all set up, a 2.5-day program that we had all of that organized at the beginning of February. And so, we had that to work with. That was our goal, content.
And I must admit, I mean, I've been to many of you. I've been very lucky to go to many of your conferences, and the content is always superb. But it's very difficult to transition that. I mean, from that point of view, Tad, we had a full program lined up for Seville, which we have rolled just completely in its entirety to next year. Fingers crossed. And in a way, obviously, a lot of that content will have to change in reflection for everything that we've been talking about for the last 5 months. So Tad, from that perspective, in terms of the content for an event like this and the complexities, I mean, I have never spent so long planning sessions before. How did that process come about, Tad?
Well, I suppose that the thing was we had to do something. We had to come up with topics. We had to look at what we were going to talk to people about. And I think in the first event, we were sort of focused on how it was affecting people generally across the world. This one is perhaps a little different, and it does. This full forum has mimicked the sort of thing we would do at a conference, with the corporate housing session and the immigration session a couple of days ago, and the sessions that we've done. But we decided to, you arranged it in exactly the same way you would for a normal conference, with a call for submissions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worked extremely well, and I'm delighted that we've been able to do what we've been able to do. But as you say, even my contribution in terms of a couple of bits and pieces that I've been doing, way overcomplicated. Having had conversations with people several times beforehand. I got one response from somebody the other day who was participating in one particular session, asking me where to send the video. And I was like, what video? I wasn't quite sure, and there is no video. But the fact of the matter is that it's complicated for them as well. I mean, let's face it, Dom, you had to send people a film of how to be a moderator in this event.
I mean, it's just so different, isn't it? Because we all know we're arranging sessions the whole time and being part of them, and you can leave that final planning. If you know what you're talking about, that final planning happens on site. You can do it the night before the dinner. You can do it during the coffee break. You're all together. It flows. And this is much more.
But I mean, it comes down to the fact, Dom, that you can actually be on the stage saying, "Where would you like the chairs? Where are you going to sit?"
Yeah.
Whereas with a virtual conference, the chairs have got to be right in place. They've got to be absolutely correctly staged. Everybody has to know what they're doing. And this film you made, which showed that people would do it on Zoom, would be in Zoom, but they also had to have the EuRA app open at the same time in order to answer the question and answers. I mean, just can you imagine it? People sitting on stage with an iPad in one hand and a telephone in the other, trying to...
I've got a question from table number 13. Yeah, I know.
It's quite ridiculous. So the
So
sooner we get back to normal, the better.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, on that sort of topic of, normality, what are your members saying? Steve, can I ask you that first? What are you hearing from your members? What do they need? How are they?
Everybody's faring as well as they can. I think, they've harnessed technology to maintain connectivity with their teams and their clients, most importantly. They've been, I learned last week from some of the conversations that many of them have been spending time getting to things, upskilling their staff, implementing new technologies, streamlining their organizations, making them more efficient, and really getting ready for what comes next. Obviously, there's a great thirst for things getting back to normal, but within that conversation, there is an expectation that the new normal is not what we had before. And I know we'll probably touch on what that looks like further in the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Steve. We will, absolutely. And Lynn, I mean, from that point of view, both you and Steve, your organizations are very connected to the corporate world, to the actual major organizers within major corporations. What are you hearing from them right now? Similar thing, let's get back to normal.
I think it depends on the industry, right? So some industries are actually starting to move people again, but I think across the board, what we're hearing from our members is that they're being pulled into discussions at the C-suite about how do you manage a virtual workforce? Because if you think about it, mobility professionals have managed kind of across time and space for a long time. They've managed global teams. And so now I think they're being pulled into discussions and it's recognized they have certain expertise about what do you do when somebody crosses, even in the US, state lines, right? What do you do about taxes? What do you do about moving somebody and their family? What do you have to do team building in a remote environment? So I think our members are being tapped for different things. And I think as they look forward for how are they going to deploy their talent, I think the one thing that hasn't changed is, despite the unemployment that's with us right now, the need for skills hasn't changed, right? And so I think there's still going to continue to be skill shortages in certain critical areas. But the question then becomes, do you have to move the employee to where that work is, or can you employ them where they are and move the work to them? Or is it some hybrid? And I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, I mean, again, it's just that it's throwing up so many new ways of thinking that we haven't really approached before. And Tad, from that point of view, obviously, just now, Tracy led the session on virtual assignments. But what are you hearing from the members, given that EuRA is 100% a provider organization? I know right at the beginning, I spoke to one of our members in Spain who was already talking about transitioning her business into coaching virtual teams. What are you hearing from the EuRA provider members?
Well, as you know, we carried out a survey, and we've talked about this already earlier in this forum. We carried out a survey in March and then again in September. And I think the most striking comment that I read back in March was, the dog is happy, plenty of walks. But seriously, other sort of comments were things like developing new methods to keep in touch with one another, trying to create a sense of community, dealing with how to work from home and discovering that actually it wasn't quite as bad as they thought. Plenty of time to learn. Many people pointed out that it was great to have the MIM trainings, and also, interestingly, a number of companies have been looking into getting the EuRA EGQS, which is the accreditation for the company. So that's absolutely brilliant. So people have been using their time sensibly and and getting things done that they ordinarily get done, which is what Steve said a little bit earlier. They've also discovered, and then this is from coming back to the September survey, which is a more recent one done just last week. People are saying there's much greater collaboration between providers. They're working more together in order to achieve what they can for their clients. And I think this is really important. I think this is something I think, and I hope that we come out of this with a kinder society, and that sort of thing is good to hear. Obviously, there's more a focus on risk management, because if you are going to move that person, if you are going to take the person to the job rather than the other way around, you've got to be absolutely sure that everything is in place if there's a problem. And I think this is where we will see changes. I think our members will be developing services that up to now nobody would have even thought of, just to ensure that people feel safe. If you have to leave your home country and go to another country, you want to be absolutely sure you're covered for medical, whatever it might be. So I think we're going to see more innovation, and that's fantastic. The other thing which is interesting to note is that if you compare the results of the March survey and the September survey, my glass is half empty became my glass is half full. So there's much more optimism among members, and that's absolutely fantastic, and long may it continue.
I think that positivity within the communication that I've been having with members is amazing, frankly. I mean, this is one of the most stunning things we've ever seen in our lifetimes, and yet people are remaining resolutely positive. I'd love to move this into a slightly different context. Steve, we were talking about this globalization. Has pushed international mobility into a whole realm that we couldn't have imagined in the 1970s and 80s. But right now there are some big geopolitical uncharted waters and headwinds around the place. Tad, I'm going to start with you. Little thing called Brexit.
Oh God, yeah. Brexit, yeah.
Heard so little about it recently, but it's still happening, right?
Yeah, I haven't heard a thing. Well, apparently it's okay for the British government to break the law just a little bit for convenience sake, which is a little bit like, you know, in this country we're not meant to have more than 6 in a room. So if we had a 7th, it's only breaking the law a little bit. It won't do any harm. And this whole thing about I don't know that I think they've actually managed to cover Brexit up with COVID-19. I think that's been a very good opportunity. And I actually think more is happening in reality than we're hearing. I don't think it's quite as desperate as you know, is portrayed in the media. We have to have some sort of agreement by the 31st of December, and I think we will have. Okay, there'll be bits and pieces that aren't quite sorted out. You know, can I have your fish? No, you can't have my fish. That sort of little argument going on. I mean, they're probably big arguments, but I think the majority of things you hear that such and such has been agreed, and it's something you wouldn't really think of, but it's all important. I mean, we are going to be affected in every single way possible, from whether or not we can drink French wine through to whether or not we can buy German drugs. Probably need one to go with the other, but, you know, but the fact is that it's almost, it's a tragedy that all this is happening at the same time, because I don't think we, as the people of the United Kingdom, or rather disunited kingdom, are really hearing an enormous amount about what's going on. So it's very, very difficult to actually know what's really happening.
Talking with our legal strategist Gordon Kerr last week, we ran a briefing on this, and he was saying that this is very time critical now. That realistically, for there to be a deal by the end of December, it needs to be hammered out like next week. So watch this space. We'll update you. And Lynn, I mean, different pressures in the US. And when I've spoken to our brilliant members in the States, and obviously right now their international business is being seriously hampered by kind of, you know, the protectionism and the closing of the visa systems. How do you see international mobility changing, shifting in the US as a result?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we have an election coming up as well. And Tad, I like your disunited kingdom. We certainly have disunited states here as well. And so, you know, look, I think even before this crisis hit, what we saw was a trend towards more protectionism and frankly towards regionalism. And so we renegotiated the Canada-US-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. And I think what all of this will do will be to accelerate some of the trends that we were already seeing towards building stronger regions. You know, I think Brexit is an example of maybe what can go wrong in a region if you're not taking care of all the issues. But I think companies, as they reconsider their supply chains, are no longer going to be content relying on having all of their supply or most of their supply in one part of the world. It's too risky. So how do we, so then that creates great opportunities, I think, for people in the mobility industry. So I think the routes of relocation may change. I think the types of relocation may also change. I think short-term business assignments are going to be challenging for quite some time. And I think we'll really question, do you jump on a plane and take a long flight for a one-day meeting or for a short-term meeting? Could that be done just as effectively virtually? But then there's going to continue to be a need for people on the ground. So I think longer term assignments where you really do make great care, like Tad was talking about how do you relocate an entire family and how do you put an infrastructure in place to support that family while they're on the ground? That's all going to become much more important.
That's a really fascinating insight, Lynn. And I must admit, we've had a lot of conversations like this. It's, you know, apart from anything else, corporations, you know, green policies, climate change policies are going to restrict business travel. I think that's going to shift enormously. And from that point of view, maybe, as you say, long-term assignments or longer-term assignments are a better view. Steve, I remember being at your brilliant conference in Calgary, which I think is 3 years ago now. And there, you know, you were talking about how Canada has basically said, if you're skilled, come on in. We want to be an open economy. So it's a very different attitude in Canada, right?
Yeah, and we talked about this. We talked about this last day. Yeah, Canada's a small country, 38 million people. We've got a declining population, and so we need people. and immigration is a big part of that plan. So the government's plan before COVID was to bring in around 400,000 people, between 300,000 and 400,000 people per year. So the target is around 1% of our population. You know, and they've got a 3-year, they have a rolling 3-year plan in order to accommodate that. Obviously with Brexit, it's been, I'm sorry, with, I listened to you too much, Tad. With COVID, Brexit, what's the difference? They're all a mess, right? But with COVID, obviously, you know, that the number of people that have been coming in is ground to like 0 pretty well. But that said, you know, since we last spoke, we had a throne speech here last week. You're familiar with that in the UK, the same type of, where the leadership lays out its program. And a lot of that was dedicated towards what are we going to do around COVID. But there were two very important factors in the announcement. And one was a strong commitment to international trade. So Canada is a trading nation, and will continue to do that. And secondly, a strong commitment to immigration. And in fact, the Prime Minister in his remarks said, you know, now is the time. Canada's got a very competitive immigration system, and we will continue down that path in order to attract the brightest and the best. Lynn is quite right that yes, there will be pockets of unemployment in those industries and sectors of industries that are going through significant change and transformation, and you know, some of them just simply will not exist in the future. But the reality is that we are going to need those highly skilled people in order to rebuild our economies after COVID. And you know, from a business perspective or business community perspective, I know that, you know, that's our immediate game plan right now, is to keep the pressure on the government to make sure that we go get out there as quickly as we can in order to get people relocated into Canada through immigration. I completely agree with Lynn around the globalization issues and the more of a regionalization of supply chains. I think that is going to be an important factor moving forward. But when we talk about mobility, the impact of all of this on mobility, you know, I think I made the point during our last conversation that I think it's a very bright and exciting time for our industry. There's, as Tad said, there's going to be a lot of new innovation and opportunities coming from this. But I also think that the days of giving people $10,000 or $20,000 and saying, hey, you know, go look after yourself, I think we're going to see a complete reversal of that for the very reasons that Lynn said. And I think we're going to see more longer term and permanent type assignment relocations than perhaps we were seeing pre-COVID. Whether that means more business in our industry, but you know, fact of the matter is, I think we're going to see fewer people being moved, but the types of those moves are going to demand a whole set of different supports and products in order to make sure that that's a success.
That's really interesting, because I mean, obviously we're looking at the whole notion of, you know, how mobility is being transformed and what the future of mobility looks like. But in a way, that future to me sort of harks back to the past, to the sort of days of, I mean, Tad, I'm going to bring this to you, because, you know, when EuRA was founded and when you started to work with the ARP, which is back in the mid 80s, assignment patterns were almost more like what Steve is describing, right?
Oh, good Lord, yes. I mean, you know, someone would arrive and they'd have a 5-day accompanied home search. And they'd spend 5 days with somebody looking after them, taking them to view properties. It would be a much more, you know, a much longer affair and much more in depth, and opportunities to get to know people better. and then they would take them to international schools or local schools or whatever it was they were looking for. I mean, it was much more intense, much better in terms of income for the relocation companies. Obviously, they could charge more money.
But the volume was smaller, right?
The
volume was lower.
Volume was smaller. But from that, we moved on to more and more people being moved, and obviously companies are moving more people. They can't afford to spend quite so much, but maybe they'll realise that they've got to go back to spending a bit more, which would be a good thing. But interestingly enough, we all said after, when 9/11 happened, oh my God, that's the end of mobility as we know it. The reality of it was that an awful lot of relocation companies in the immediate aftermath were very, very busy helping people to repatriate. And then about 6 months later, everybody realized that they actually needed people on the ground. So they were very busy bringing people back again. And this won't be the same. This isn't going to be the same, but there'll be some sort of reaction to this that will mean that companies can develop their businesses and move in a slightly different direction, but still have enough for them to have to continue. This is not the end. This is just the beginning of a new beginning.
Well, I think you said too, Tad, that some of you. Sorry, I think you said in one of the conversations that some of your members are now looking at, how do they provide coaching for virtual work teams, and so there's going to be lots of that. I do think home searches in schools and things probably. Technology is going to have a big role to play in that as well. But at the end of the day, we need leaders that have got global savvy. And you can only get global savvy by, being there and being in those communities and working with those teams and figuring out how you bring all of that together. This does not replicate global savvy at all, and I don't think that's going to go away.
I completely agree. And Lynn, for those people watching this who don't know your background, you came from the Society for Human Resource Management. So those conversations around the shift of mobility, and particularly I'm thinking about duty of care. How do you see that?
So one of the things I've been thinking about with duty of care for a long time is about 5 years ago, a group, the International Labor Organization in Geneva, started looking at what are companies' obligations to migrant workers. And when they were talking about it, they were really looking at kind of your lower skilled migrant workers in parts of the world where if there was a disaster or political unrest, I don't know if anybody ever envisioned a pandemic, they would be left kind of on their own devices without passports, without money. And we saw some of this play out. So what we did at the time is we went in and we said, look, we have the companies we work with, the big multinationals, have very sophisticated mechanisms in place to help their employees out of these situations. And so this pandemic has been a test of that. And I think that's where, they're going to continue to hone, what do you do? And I think rather than being reactive, I think what will happen is you're going to have some conversations with families up front, right? So if something happens, will you want to be in lockdown? At least we have this scenario we can play with. Who knows what other novel situations might come up. But, would you want to be in lockdown there? Do you want to go to a third country? Can you come back? And some of that will be worked out in advance. We can never plan for everything, but now we have another thing we can plan for and another type of situation to think about.
I think interestingly, in the old days, somebody would be told that they were being sent to, I don't know, Portugal or something. And they'd say, oh, that's excellent, I'll be delighted to go to Portugal. And very little else would be discussed, we're going to Portugal. People would think it was an intrusion to ask them if they had a wife and family type thing. I mean, maybe not as extreme as that, but you can't, these days, as you say, you've got to ask them, are they be prepared to stay in lockdown? So that's a massive shift. It's a shift which is involving the entire family rather than just the individual who works for the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very interesting point, Tad, and it's almost like, you know, the levels of risk that assignees faced, you know, pre-COVID are very different to the levels of risk that they will now perceive post-COVID.
Yes.
Because, you know, so I mean, Lynn, from that point of view, again, you know, the psychological impact of this on assignees and security, how do you perceive that?
I think assignees themselves are going to be asking these questions, right? They are going to be saying, what is the support you're going to provide me? What will happen if? So I think on both sides, we have a whole bunch of new questions that we know might need to be answered. So I think we'll have to figure out how to tackle those in advance. I also think as you look at the younger generations, at the millennials and Gen Z's coming up, they are going to ask different questions and demand different things. And you know, then you get into the whole issue of, you know, of sustainability. Well, does it make sense to move? And, you know, what's the lower environmental impact to pick up a family and move them once, or to have somebody going back and forth all of the time? So I think we have those considerations. So values will change. And I think from the company side, one of the things they have to look at, and that our industry has not been good at, is inclusion, right? We have to make sure that we are inclusive across every aspect of society. And so both in kind of thinking about who the assignees and your transferees might be, but then also within our own profession, you know, how are we building diverse and inclusive mobility teams who are going to understand the different situations that people might find themselves in. So I think there's a lot of change that's coming. That's a good thing, right? Because I agree with Steve that the new normal will not be the old normal, right? It's going to be something different. We're going to have a much greater emphasis on technology. I think you're going to have a greater emphasis on customer service. It's going to be critical. So it's technology, customer service, sustainability, and then also, you know, equality and justice.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you touched on that, Lynn, because last week we had our conference, and we had 2 sessions on diversity and inclusion. And I completely agree. It's this mosaic that is coming together. That, in my mind, it just creates. Yes, it's different, and we're going to have to figure out how we address those challenges within this industry. And I think that's exciting.
It is.
You know, I think that for too long, mobility has been seen as a transaction.
Yeah.
So, you know, we get the family, we do this, we get a truck, sell the house, put them on a plane or a ship or whatever, and mobility is supposed to be just orchestrating those points. Now they're going to be responsible for the selection, working with talent to make sure that they're selecting the right candidates, that they are following the diversity and inclusion policies of the organization. They're ensuring that duty of care of the employees are being met. Could be their environmental commitments are being achieved through this. The duty of care, the whole issue around compliance, developing policies for work from anywhere. There's just a lot of opportunity here
and
for mobility to get their heads around.
I completely agree with you. And Tad, from that point of view, I mean, we've always said, I mean, the EuRA members are so innovative, and they can, you know, really pivot so quickly. What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, you know, from the very word go, when this all came out and they were having to deal with issues that they'd never had to deal with before, they were turning to, especially where they work directly with HR themselves, they would go to them and they would say, look, you know, we've got to do this, we've got to do that. Obviously, we can't do it for free. And they would negotiate whatever it was that needed to be done. But everybody knew it had to be done, because the company had a duty of care towards their employees. They had all sorts of other issues that they had to deal with, like people up sticks going home and taking the keys with them. It was rather difficult to go and clear the house afterwards. So they came up with ways of dealing with it. in terms of, Steve, you talked about home searches using more technology. Well, they had to, because people were discouraged from viewing properties. And what they were doing was sending people videos of properties, getting them down to 2, saying they had to choose 2 or 3 or even just 2, and then maybe taking them to see those properties, and only one member of the family being allowed to go into the property, and travel to the property in 2 cars. So it was, but they managed it without any issue whatsoever. They just got on with it. In other situations, people will go, well, I can't do that. No, that's not possible. We can, but they were, because the majority of our members and majority of the businesses are small to medium sized, they can react so much quicker. And also, most of them are owned by the people running them. So they need to react because they need an income. So I think, all in all, the mobility industry globally is really ready to go and to act and to sort things out. And I think they've showed it brilliantly.
If I could just jump in, I agree with everything you've said there. And I think one of the things that we as leaders have to talk to our community about is their need to be more politically engaged with policymakers. And I don't mean taking sides, but what I mean is we have to get our needs out there in front of policymakers, whether it's something as simple. One of the things we focused on was making sure that in every state you can have electronic signatures on mortgage documents, right? Yeah. So how do we do that? I think immigration is an issue. Steve, you and I have worked with governments around the world on that for a long time. How do we remove those barriers? So I think as an industry, one of our real opportunities is to come together. And I think we think of ourselves as industries, but do policymakers, whether in London or Washington or Ottawa, do they think of us as an industry? So how do we bring the facts forward to them and say, as an industry, we've been really hurt by this, but here's the policies and sometimes it's little things that we need you to change that's going to get the economy moving again. And I think particularly as we get into different types of assignments and non-traditional workforces. So, as companies start to shift their talent towards relying on gig workers, well, immigration laws are not set up for that. Right. So how are we going to manage in this really new world? So I think it's exciting. I think there's some real opportunities here for us, but we need to come together as an industry to figure out what our policy ask will be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just to reinforce your point, Lynn, during one of our sessions last week, it was on compensation, global compensation, and how the way in which we tax income and where we tax income, and the type of work that it's archaic. It doesn't reflect what our companies need today. So that's a perfectly good example of how we could be collectively working, saying to government, if you want the economy to rebuild, this is a reality. People are not going back to working the way they were. And so, we need these kinds of directives from, whether it's the OECD on tax treaties and making sure that all countries sign on to that. That's a great point. Great point.
It really is, and actually, it sort of brings me to my sort of closing ideas in a way, because we're getting close to time now. But pretty well, a lot of the things that you talked about have really centered around collaboration. There's that collaboration between the policymakers and the corporations, the collaboration between the providers and the corporations themselves. I think one thing that's impressed me so much over the past 5 months has been the increasing communication and collaboration between the stakeholders that hold our industry together. There seems to have been like let's drop the pretense and just talk, because we're all going to find a way out of this, and the only way we're going to find a way out of this is together. So thank you for raising those points.
Can I just mention that yesterday we had the
collaboration session.
Where we brought together all the known relocation associations in Europe, from EuRA, which is the new Italian association, which has been formed has been motivated to form because of COVID-19, right back to the ARP, which of course is the longest running association in Europe. And the whole point of that is that EuRA as a global organization cannot possibly start trying to influence governments around the world individually. That would be absolutely impossible, and we'd need a staff of about 1,000.
One day.
On the other hand, do it. But on the other hand, motivating the smaller associations around Europe to have a go at their governments to try and get recognition. In fact, the ARP is just about to go down a completely new route. We've been offered some help in terms of lobbying, and we're going to go for it because we want to get changes in things within the United Kingdom to try and help our members make it easier for them to get relocatees in and out, and also to encourage people to move where it is necessary within the UK. So, I mean, this is something which is very much happening, and it's very, very interesting that these associations are all very happy to get together, and who knows, we might have regular meetings on a Europe-wide basis in the future.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great. Tad, thank you so much for that insight. Lynn, Steve, it's always a pleasure to catch up with you both.
Thank you
so much for your insights. And we'll continue these collaborative discussions, I'm certain, over the coming months. But all it remains for me to say is to all of you members in WERC, to all of your members in CERC, to all of the EuRA members, we will get through this. We will get through this together. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And the traditional Zoom wave goodbye. Bye.